Now we're going to head to our last panel before we have lunch. And this one is actually really connected to this theme, which is clean tech and environmental protection. Now, Chinese firms are now major players in green infrastructure across the global south, channeling roughly $80 billion into overseas clean tech projects in the past year alone, and more than $180 billion since early 2023, from solar and wind to batteries and green hydrogen. So this panel will examine how African and Latin American governments can negotiate greener Chinese-backed projects in practice, enforcing environmental and social safeguards, integrating climate adaptation into BRI-style infrastructure, and using climate finance and blended instruments to raise standards. The panelists for today will be Dr. Asma Belem of Howard University, Dr. Victoria Chonqing, non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. She's joining us virtually. And Professor Anita Plummer of Howard University, and the moderator is Dr. Liliana Diaz of Johns Hopkins SAIS. Please give them a round of applause.
Yes. Can we check that Victoria is?
Yes, I am here. Hello.
Okay, perfect. Just a technology check before we start. Well, good morning, soon to be afternoon. It is a pleasure for me to welcome you to the Bloomberg Center, the home of SAIS, and I am a member of the faculty at the Americas Focus area here at SAIS. I teach energy and climate policy in the Americas, and this discussion is very close to my heart. I have the pleasure to moderate this panel. And to start, let me just frame the discussion. Over the past year alone, Chinese firms have channeled more than $80 billion into clean energy infrastructure across Africa and Latin America. And that includes solar farms, wind power, battery manufacturing, green hydrogen production. And this represents both a tremendous opportunity for the regions, as well as a complex challenge. How do governments ensure that these investments support environmental sustainability rather than undermine it? And how do communities monitor projects and hold the developers accountable? And how might China's domestic advances in renewable technology be leveraged for green development partnerships with these regions? Today, we are here not just to analyze what is happening, but to share practical insights from the ground. What works, what doesn't, and why. And our three panelists bring research from Burkina Faso to Kenya to Peru, examining both official narratives and the lived realities of communities navigating these partnerships. And let me introduce them to you. You heard that Dr. Asma Belem is a visiting fellow at the Center for African Studies at Howard University, where she previously held a postdoctoral fellowship with the African China Initiative at Georgetown and Howard University. Her research examines the political economy of foreign aid, environmental governance, and African politics, with a particular emphasis on Chinese engagement in Francophone Africa. Her detailed case study of the Kua forest in Burkina Faso analyzes how a proposed Chinese-funded hospital triggered environmental civil society mobilization and how domestic political contexts shape the outcomes of such movements. Dr. Victoria Chonqing, who is joining us virtually, is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arch Latin America Center. She actually speaks Spanish and Mandarin and previously served as the director's assistant at the Center for China and Asia Pacific Studies at the University del Pacífico in Lima, Peru. Her research examines the political economy of China-Latin American relations, focusing on how Latin American countries exercise agency in their engagement with China, trade and investment patterns, and the implications for regional development strategies. And finally, to my right, I have Dr. Anita Plummer, who is an associate professor of African Studies and executive director of the Center for Women, Gender, and Global Leadership at Howard University. She is the convener of the African China Initiative Research Working Group on Demand Disruption and Transformation, an African agency in the digital geopolitics. Her research focuses on Kenya's engagement with China, which he actually published in a book titled Kenya Engagements with China, Discourse, Power, and Agency. A chapter in her book examines the environmental and political implications of Chinese-backed infrastructure projects in Kenya, with a focus on proposed coal developments in the Mui Basin and Lamu, analyzing how local communities, particularly women farmers and environmental justice activists, have successfully mobilized to contest extractive projects that threaten land, livelihoods, and ecological sustainability. So with that introduction on our esteemed panelists, which are all scholars and the research focus, let us commence this panel. We have about 40 minutes of discussion that I will moderate with our esteemed panelists, and then I will open it up to questions from the audience. So if you have questions, please jot them down and keep them, and I will open the mic about 50 minutes to the close of the session. So let us begin. And let me begin with Victoria. Victoria, let me start with the issue of agency. From your research on the political economy of China and Latin American relations, what is distinctive about Chinese actors' approach to green infrastructure compared to the Western or multilateral models?
All right. Thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be in this panel. Sorry that I cannot be online. Just to make sure you can hear me clearly, correct?
Yes.
Yes, okay, perfect. So to your question, I think that it's important to understand, and let me first frame this in the context of green development, right? Climate change, environmental policies. So when we're thinking about Chinese investments in this particular aspect, or just in general too, right? I think that's something to keep in mind is that we usually approach it with the idea that China is absolutely different, right? Or that China is very distinctive. Comparatively speaking, the Chinese firms behave just like any other firm, right? A North American firm and European firm. Now, when it comes to the environment, of course, China has had the reputation of polluting, of violating, right, many policies, not only outside of China, but also inside of China. Something that hasn't been highlighted, and I think it's forgotten in the conversation due to this reputation, is that, and quoting my colleague Alex Wong from UCLA, who is actually a environmental lawyer, who looks at China around the world and what they do or what it does, is that China has a long march, let's call it that way, right, to bring development to sustainability. So in that regard, I think we are forgetting that we also need to examine what China has to offer vis-a-vis what it doesn't offer, and how our own countries, here talking about agency, can take advantage of those characteristics. Now, in what it offers, China does have guidelines, and it has had those guidelines for decades, right? It has taken up since the 2000s, right? Heightened in 2010s, and especially in the last 10 years, 10 years or 5 years or so. A lot of these guidelines will highlight the meeting of not only environmental goals, right, governance goals, also mitigation of political and security risk. And they also meeting economic goals. So in that regard, the activities of Chinese companies, especially when it comes to investments that are related to environmental issues, so companies in which these goals, right, all of them where they meet, are going to benefit more. On the other hand, where the companies, or let's say where the activity, right, does not necessarily meet all these goals, some of the, let's call it behaviors, perhaps, right, will fall short. So in this regard, as we have seen, at least in my region, which is Latin America regions, we do have something that really has fulfilled, right, all these different mechanisms that China is seeking for, green development, dealing with overcapacity, right, dealing with reputational risk, right. So in this regard, green energy, renewables, right? Energy, renewables, and we have seen that in manufacturing. We have seen that with the development of EVs and whatnot. So what makes it especially Chinese? Let me put it this way. It's not that it's especially Chinese, but rather there are characteristics of how these companies operate or have been operating. Number one, the meeting of the goals, right? Which really encompasses all these different characteristics, which I would say is not necessarily different from Western companies. But something to highlight is that it is very state-led. So the participation and the role of the state, right, will be heavier and will be prioritized. And here's where the Latin American part comes about and how Latin American countries can deal with it. Chinese companies, and I'm putting it in a big bubble, right? Because we do have to separate them between SOEs, between private companies and whatnot, is that Chinese companies will do as much as our own governments and regulations allow them to do. There is a preference, of course, in the state-to-state interaction, state-to-state development and whatnot, and conversations, but, right, in structures and in systems where it's not only about the state, where there is conversation with local governments, where there is conversation with local communities and civil societies, Chinese companies will operate according to these standards as long as we have those mechanisms and the tools to make it enforceable and to seek accountability. Related to that, Chinese firms, especially when it comes to environmental issues, right? There is, unfortunately, and that has been a challenge not only for China, but also our Latin American countries, is that there is limited transparency, right? That doesn't mean that there is no transparency 100%, but rather there is a lack of, let's say, presenting more information that is needed, especially when it comes to dealing with monitoring, with dealing with the degree in which these environmental, I guess, challenges are addressed. The third part, and I'm going to be precise, I'm going to finish with this and we can continue the conversation later on, is that even though China has come up with this green development, green environmentalism, right, and really has become a very proactive player worldwide, and not just in my region, in Latin America, is that at the end of the day, in many times, economics will overshadow, for example, civil rights, right? So why do I mention this? Because especially in regions or in countries where a lot of Chinese activity, and this comes from the previous panels, are especially in the extractive industries, is that civil rights issues, how can I say, like social conflicts due to environmental issues, unfortunately, are not dealt or cannot be dealt with the proper or adequate tools, simply because, again, right, the economics rights, if you want to call it that, will overshadow those. And again, this is not just from the Chinese side, but also from the Latin American side, where the Chinese companies will do and will offer and will react or respond as much as these host countries allow them to. So I guess that this is just very in general, giving you a general framework of these Chinese companies. And again, right, that at the end of the day, and going back to, I think something that Juliana and the previous panelists have mentioned, especially in the extractive industries, where very have a very high impact in the environment, is that a lot of the story is not just about the actions of the companies themselves, but also of the institutional and the mechanisms available to really deal with the different environmental issues that come at play. So I'm just giving you that general aspect. So I hope that opens up the conversation rather than give you a final answer. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. I thought that was very to the point and gave us a framework to continue. So let me turn to Anita. You studied Chinese-backed energy investments in Kenya, including the contested coal developments in the Mau Basin and the Mu. And I was curious how these tensions played out on the ground when governments are promoting green development while also advancing extractive projects.
Great, thank you so much for the question. And I just want to affirm what has been said previously in terms of green development models. I don't think we can de-link the conversation from infrastructural development, right? Because when we think about green development in Africa, it tends to be linked to energy projects, whether it's clean energy projects or dirty energy projects. So it's usually framed in that dichotomy, which I don't think is very useful, because in Kenya, we see that both coexist within the same country, right? China invests greatly in geothermal energy, expanding the grid, solar energy, as well as the two projects that you just mentioned. So with this coexistence, it's, not necessarily a contradiction. It's political economy, right? That's what governments do. Governments have needs that they're trying to meet: energy gaps, employment, fiscal pressures, and the urgency of delivering, right, for their constituents. But the problem is, with both cases, is that what tends to take on the cost burden is governance and participation from normal people, right? Everyday people. So that's where you mentioned agency in the first question. And, there's government agency, and then there's the street level agency on the ground, which, when we talk about conservation, green development models, generally the most powerful forces in the country are those on the street level, our NGOs, our small business owners, our youth, who want to hold their own governments accountable. Because, as was said earlier, Chinese companies are restricted by what local governments and national governments, tell them what they can and can't do. They tend to be very responsive, which is quite extraordinary. So when we think about China's green development model, it's generally the scale and the speed that these large-scale energy projects are rolled out, which makes it very appealing, right? It's not moral. It's procedural and institutional. So if we're going to compare, green energy, I don't want to link it to the West, but Western development models, they tend to be slower because there are feasibility studies that have to be done, environmental impact assessment, safeguards. The procurement process for land can take more time, which is a problem. So governments have to balance that. And for governments, it becomes a problem when communities aren't engaged early on in the process. And China, so it's governments, but also China can be targeted. So when we think about the costs of green energy versus development, we have to look at the political costs on the ground, and how people are and are not engaged in these types of projects.
Thank you so much, Anita. Asma, let me move on to you and focus on your work on the Francophone West Africa. And I wish you could speak about how civil society organizations respond when they hear green development, which sometimes is rhetoric from both the Chinese and the government, but what they experience is a different type of development. What's the gap between promise and reality?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for your question. in Africa, green development is a matter of survival because, when the extreme weather event happen and it results in maybe drought or flooding, it affects the farmers, right? When soil and water is polluted due to mining, it affects again the farmers. And you have a large chunk of the working population employed by the farming sector. At the same time, you have rapid population growth and urbanization. So this growing population need energy. Choosing clean energy is not just because it's clean, but we want to provide the needed service at a cheaper cost. And if you listen to the African environmental activists and climate activists, they are aware of the fact that some of these challenges that African countries are experiencing is due to the action of larger greenhouse gas emitter, and they want to hold them to account. So they are asking them to fund climate action in Africa. Oftentimes, you also see them kind of pushing back against Western conservation model, whereby forests are protected in Africa, but this model actually also violate the human right of the communities who rely on those forests, perhaps I don't know, for water, for farming, or either because maybe they have this sacred shrine in the forest. So you see a pushback against that as well. And you see a rise in resource nationalism and resource sovereignty. They tend to make the case, how come we can't leverage our own natural resources to improve our economies. They are not satisfied with the political system in Africa because they believe it's not necessarily producing the best leaders or improving the material condition of the masses. So, and they have seen foreign investors, whether that is from the West or from the East, lacking in terms of fulfillment of the corporate social responsibility or mitigating environmental impact. And in a lot of these investments, you also see that even if there is a stakes of the country or the government within the mining companies, it's a minority stakes. And you have governance challenges. So usually, especially nowadays, resource nationalism and resource sovereignty is on the rise. Yeah, in the public opinion among the youth. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Asa. This is something that just came into my mind, listening to you three speak about the green model that China uses. I think 2 years ago, we had a session on China, and one of my students told me, perhaps it's too much to expect from China, which is an actor that has a short time span of experience investing and developing projects internationally. It didn't have a model domestically. So is there hope that these experiences and these learnings are going to fine-tune the business model of Africa when it invests outside its borders and it goes to a developing country which may not have institutional capacity to impose the safeguards or enforce them to start with. But maybe either the private or the SOEs will learn to be better citizens. Is there hope? And I let you think about it for a second, and maybe I can start with Anita.
Sure, I'll give a very short response. So the green growth agenda is on the agenda in every sub-Saharan African country. So this idea that the model is a Chinese model is flawed, right? From the African Union all the way down. So in terms of, monitoring and enforcement of what's happening with these projects, if local mechanisms, government mechanisms fail, that's where the shadow enforcement happens through civil society. And this is what I saw in Kenya, right? So one, I think we need to change our orientation. If the development is happening in a host country that's Africa, the first place we need to look at is the development agendas within that specific country. So on a national level, there's the green growth agenda. The environmental conservation and protection is socially embedded too and culturally embedded, right? So it's not delinked, from economics, but this environmental conservation imperative is deeply cultural too. So respect for cultural sites is a recurring theme that I saw both in Mui Basin and in Lamu. And then finally, there are about 30 different climate-related policy papers. Now, you may say, is that too much happening, right? When it comes to one actor, is there competition? Not necessarily, because it's people locally on the ground who are the ones enforcing local laws. And just to close the loop on your original question, Lamu was very successful in stopping a coal plant from being developed. And they used a combination of public shaming, of grassroots activism, but they used the Kenyan courts. That's what? Oh yeah, it was the Kenyan court. I mean, recently the court case was upheld to prevent this coal plant from being built. So for me, there is hope, even though we say, institutions in Africa aren't strong enough to be able to, counter external powers. But if there's enough political mobilization on the ground, and if there's a strong independent court system, right, there is space to really pressure local governments. It's not about China. I want to say that. It's about the Kenyan government fulfilling its responsibilities and duties to their own citizens, right? Because it's China today, it could be the US tomorrow. So, their ability to really buck against elite interests, that's why I say it's not China, it's elite interests, is what's key in terms of building this counter agency from below and this shadow enforcement from below when it comes to environmental conservation.
Thank you so much, Linda. Let me go back to Victoria and let's focus on the Latin American comparative perspective. To your knowledge, Victoria, which countries have been more successful at negotiating strong safeguards and why? And what institutional factors have made a difference?
Thank you for the question. And actually, I should echo a lot of what Anita is saying in here, right? When we're seeking monitoring and accountability, not only from the Chinese firms, but also other firms, a lot has to do with the host countries' governments themselves and how they respond or support, in this case, civil society and the different communities, environmental groups, NGOs, etc., that are trying to support the monitoring process. So rather than saying which countries has been successful, I think that I would step back a little bit and just start at least from the Latin American region. I mean, we do have a lot of natural resources. And in fact, if you look at the region itself, right, we, on average, have a higher percentage, for example, of using renewable energies, like 33%, where the global average is 13%. But then within that world, right, we also have very high impact mining, high impact hydropower activities like critical minerals, et cetera. So to your point, I think that where we have seen a very successful, if you will, or very responsive, I guess Chinese companies in terms of really reacting and responding to environmental agencies, and were precisely the countries that made sure that those regulations, right, were followed through monitoring, through agency, through local government, and what have you. And I would say, for instance, in the case of Peru, right, which aside from all the political instability having here, I think that we had our environmental peak, if you will, back in 2008 through perhaps 2012, where we have a major or very big Chinese mining companies having very big projects. For example, in this case, Chinalco, right, which was at that point or at that time, let's say, a new, or it was viewed as a new type of Chinese environment, because they actually not only had to build an entire open mine pit, but it included the relocation of a town. And in this case, there was really a lot of activity and exchange, not only between the company, but the local actors that included the communities, that included the municipalities, that included the national government. So in that case, right, relatively speaking, at that point, it was successful to the extent that the Chinese companies were really operating, or in this case, Chinalco was really operating under international standards. Now, when we transfer to today, there's still community or social conflict issues. There are still demands about pollution and what have you. But at the end of the day, it's not so much about what the Chinese company, again, back to our initial points, right? What these companies are doing or not doing, but rather are our countries having these structures, are keeping these things accountable. And I am not sure, and I'm not familiar with how it works in Africa, but at least from what I was able to see in many Latin American countries, right? When you look at civil society, when you look at environmental NGOs, rather than looking at them as mechanisms to support and to support and strengthen monitoring, to strengthen governance, they actually are seen as an obstruction, right? An obstruction to economic development, an obstruction to these very expensive projects, right? That in many ways can bring economic goals. So here is where, I don't know if to call it contradiction, but here is where we have fighting goals, right, that are met, and it is within the challenge of our countries in how they deal with it. Because on the one hand, in many of them, we do need those, or we do need to meet those economic interests, those development interests. But at the same time, right, what is the risk? The environmental risk comes about, the social risk comes about. So in how these countries are reacting, it really depended on how responsive our own countries are first, vis-a-vis just what the Chinese companies or even non-Chinese companies are doing. And I'm going to finish with this last part, is that something that should be emphasized, right, is not how all these different actors, local actors, right, not just national actors or external actors, but how every actor, especially the local actors, are operating not within this weak system or broken system of weak governance and transparency when it comes to environmental issue, but how these actors are still operating despite these weaknesses. And I think that here is where our own countries really need to step it up, in the sense of, again, rather than looking at it as a obstruction, it's more like how these also play a role, these players also play a role in strengthening accountability and transparency.
Thank you very much. I really like the ending of your remarks on transparency and accountability. And it's a nice segue to my question to Asma. In preparing this panel, I read a bit of your work. I was very interested in the Cuba Forest case that you researched in Burkina Faso, because it's all about civil society. It's about how communities come together to push for the change that is required. And so my question to you is, what made that mobilization so effective, and what lessons can be learned so that other communities can also take advantage?
Thank you. So the Kua case, it was a case of a Chinese-sponsored hospital. The authorities of the countries pushed for a state forest, to be partially declassified in order to have the hospital there. There was also clearly a Chinese preference for that particular site, and which caused the environmental civil society movement. It was successful because the civil society got the government to do an environmental impact assessment. And that was not given at first. And then the approach was more participatory because, the environmental impact assessment also involved doing a survey and discussing with all stakeholders to collect the opinion. And in the end, the forest was preserved. So if you look at the design of Burkinabe environmental laws, whether it's the code of forestry, the code of the environment, or the code of mining, it clearly states that project that could potentially have an environmental impact must go through an impact assessment or a strategic environmental impact assessment. And the finding of that study must be submitted to the Minister of Environment, who would then decide whether or not to issue a permit. And when you pay attention to the law, it's like, the authorities are regulating a potential private investor. But in that specific case, they were also the violator of the environmental regulation of the country. So what the civil society did was to notice that violation and partner with others who know the law better and could interpret it. So there was a broad coalition of actors who joined the movement. Environmental lawyers threatened to sue any actor. And in the framing of any actor, it seems like they were threatening the Chinese and the government of Burkina Faso, who would try to alter the integrity of the forest. In the movement, you had also opposition political parties who joined in, and they took the issue to the National Assembly and were questioning the executive branch on it. In general, political opportunity structures are quite important. Like Anita said, a strong and independent justice system, parliamentary oversight. I think even freedom of press and freedom of expression to allow the civil society to do their campaign. What I also noticed is that there was a lack of transparency that the civil society leveraged in their favor, whether that was done knowingly or unknowingly. They did their research. They could identify alternative site news that, perhaps the city council had released a large plot of land to a real estate development company. They had other examples of alternative site. And we're making the case, if, there are alternative sites, surely why fixate yourself on the forest? And in a way, speculated on a potential Eden agenda, which no one knew about. And you don't have enough evidence to support the Eden agenda, but blaming or accusing the Chinese and the city council, and I think it increased the number of sympathizers to the movement, and it also played in their favor. Occasionally, they had also ideological and symbolic figures that they reference. They mentioned Thomas Sankara, the father of Burkinabe Revolution, who was also an environmentalist. They mentioned another Burkinabe who fought against desertification in Burkina Faso, and all of that sort of played in their favor in having a successful campaign.
Thank you so much for sharing the details. I think it's illuminating to see how civil society comes together. And also, that is not only about criticizing, but also presenting a solution. Because if you have a solution, you have a way forward. Let me move into a topic that is of interest to Africa and Latin America because of the heavy economic dimensions. And this is the issue of debt. Many African and Latin American countries now carry substantial debt to China. Often this debt is tied to infrastructure projects that were financed over the past decade. And at the same time, China today has made a remarkable domestic advance in the production of clean energy technologies, such as solar panels. It's a global leader in electric vehicle batteries. And this actually creates a potential opportunity. And while I was thinking about how to frame this question, I was thinking about the possibilities that innovative financial instruments could provide here. Could existing debt be restructured through innovative green finance mechanisms that leverage China's renewable energy expertise, for example? And could that payments be directed toward renewable projects that use Chinese technology transfer? And what this would look like in practice, and what are the opportunities and risks for from a host country perspective? So to start with, let me go to Victoria, to Latin America, and ask her to speak about the debt situation in Latin America vis-a-vis China. And what sort of innovative financial instruments have you seen appear? And what are the concerns about sovereignty that these possible solutions may bring?
Okay, I just unmuted myself. Sorry about that. So thank you for the question. I think something to worth thinking about, and I'm going to be very precise in my answer actually in here, is that China has invested a lot in terms of especially right for renewable energy. So when we look at renewable energy, particularly in countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Chile, right, we see Chinese companies not only operating like we used to see them before in the sense of extracting, right, a resource, but rather here we see the creation of plants, we see the bringing in of Chinese technology, if you will, a technology transfer when it comes to this particular sector. And here is precisely when I want to go back to my the first question when you asked, right, what is distinctive Chinese? Here is precisely where you have all the elements or all the goals that are meeting together or conflating together, right? When you have the environmental goals, when you have the development goals, and mitigating risk and overcapacity, et cetera, et cetera. Now, when we come to debt, I think that what we have seen, and this perhaps goes more in the first panel that today, right? We actually have seen a slowdown in the lending, I guess, amount, right, of I guess Chinese financing in the region, and a lot has to do also with that with Chinese own domestic policies and the idea that we have heard about this, right? Small is beautiful. Some conversations have happened or have been proposed over the last 5 years or so in how we can use Chinese financing, or not just Chinese financing, but to I guess put together financing and meeting environmental goals, right? The development, the sustainable development goals and what have you, is to think about, for example, debt for nature, right? Or debt for climate swaps and green bonds. So all of this exists in the region, in Latin America. China has not participated in any of them. And I think it's worth saying that there is a little bit of challenges in this regard, because even in the countries where debt for nature has happened, or you have the execution of them, for example, in Ecuador, right, or where green bonds happen, for instance, there is no consensus, a regional consensus, right, in what climate change means and in what green development means. So every single country will operate according to its own taxonomy, according to its own monitoring processes. And that makes it challenging. And I think that here is where we can exploit or take advantage, right, of I guess, like the Chinese, what China can offer. And I say this because, for instance, in just last year, in 2025, I think that China has finally come up with its global green taxonomy, in which it has a very specific list of projects that can count as green bonds, right? Or for green bonds. And I think that in that regard, the region can really exploit that. But of course, the negotiation becomes challenging because precisely we need to have a common taxonomy. We need to agree of what kind of projects, right, can count as qualifying for green bonds or can qualify for climate change or can qualify for green development. And that has shifted or is a little bit different depending on the countries. Number one. Number two, the monitoring processes. And again, it will go back to the institutional structures and it will go back to the mechanisms that we have because it really demands perhaps to a lower degree when it comes to default nature vis-a-vis the green bonds, in that there needs to be mechanisms for monitoring. There needs to be mechanisms of transparency and communication, not only for the investors themselves, but also, right, for the projects themselves. Like what qualifies as such in these particular aspects. So to your question, I know that I was a little long-winded in that. I just wanted to give the context because at least in the Latin American context, and I don't know how it's precisely in Africa, there is the opportunity to take advantage of these new mechanisms that China itself it's starting, right, to release. Whether or not China has done great, therefore nature, it hasn't, right? And I doubt it. I don't think that they will come up with this or they will participate in this anytime soon, to be fairly honest. But I think that where we actually do see possibilities is where green bonds comes about. And China has just started that last year. That's some opportunity for the region. But again, we do need to strengthen certain mechanisms to be able to take advantage of those issues. That's at least how it looks in Latin America. And again, I love to see what Anita and Asma have to say on Africa.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And yes, of course, I'd love to have your views, perspective on what sort of innovative financing can actually be deployed and how civil society and the actual people who are the stewards of these natural assets will be partaking.
Mm-hmm. I think it's quite innovative because countries who do have heavy debt tend to face more pressure to extract more or rely on commodity export to relieve the burden of the debt. Even with the Atiwa Forest Reserve case in Ghana involving a Sino-Hydro deal, the issue was that the loan has been taken. Some of the infrastructure may have been commenced, and whereas the government was relying on the export of aluminum and bauxite to pay for the loan, but the industry was not performing very well. So they decided to explore other area of mining and considered the Atiwa Forest Reserve, which is a site of high biodiversity, and you saw the civil society push back against it. So I think it will be innovative if we can find a solution to those debt. But at the same time, it's a little bit odd because we don't know all the component of that new arrangement. Who is going to purchase the debt? Is it a Chinese actor? And what will be the term of the purchase? Is it going to be more expensive for the host government in Africa to pay back, or is it going to be less expensive? Of course, you would see some form of financial relief, but where would the money go, into a green project? What green project? But from the civil society, perspective, any green projects do also have environmental costs. So any environmental safeguard that applies to green project would apply if in the future we had that type of arrangement. Yeah.
Well, I think we are very close to ending our time for the moderated discussion. And if I can ask my panelists to, in less than 1 minute, give me your opinion, one concrete practical recommendation. Basically, what one step that can be taken tomorrow to improve environmental outcomes without derailing investment, based on your research and your experience with this topic. Anita?
So I think for policymakers, engagement with the community should not be seen as an obstruction, but as mitigation. That in order to save money down the line, save time, just include the community. And one thing about the debt environmental financing structures, if accountability is upwards, meaning governments are accountable to lenders and not accountable to their constituencies, that's a problem. That means it's failed. So this type of arrangement should not happen within finance ministries. I think they need to originate in environmental ministries of the environment. I think that would be one concrete positive step.
Okay, I would say so when you study cases of environmental violation committed in Africa by Western investors, oftentimes you see that the communities, maybe they try to hold the investor to account domestically and didn't succeed, but they collaborated with perhaps Western NGOs or, environmental justice law firm based in the West. And some of those cases were litigated in the UK, and later on, the community eventually succeeded. So I think if there is more interaction between African environmental NGOs and activists with their Chinese counterpart, even if it is state-sponsored Chinese environmental NGOs, it will be helpful in terms of interpreting and understanding Chinese overseas regulation better, and perhaps even improve the communication with the Chinese investor. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Asma. Victoria?
On my side, I think in addition to what both panelists or my colleagues have mentioned, right? For a lot of our developing countries, I mean, we do see environmental efforts that in many ways are going to go parallel with activity that really have high impact, environmental impact, given the nature of our countries and the economic activities that we have. So in this case, I think that rather than looking at, for example, an activity like mining, which is the industry that I look at the most, right, as a contradiction, which can be, right, try to provide a more sustainable lens, and in this case, demand not only for Chinese companies, but in this case, take advantage, right, of this green development trend in China and among Chinese leadership, and really say, well, if you have a mining investment or a investment that has a high impact, right, why don't you include green technology that can mitigate some of the risk? Is it gonna be 100% bulletproof? No, but to include certain mechanisms or certain I guess processes, right, that can somewhat help into mitigating certain aspects, and think about it as something that can build sustainability, right, that goes hand in hand with economic development.
Very nicely put, Victoria. Thank you so much. I'd like to open to the floor for questions if there is any. There is a microphone in the middle. And we can take 2 or 3 and address them. Can you please come close to the microphone? Thank you.
Thank you, Paul Matillia, NDU. I wanted to find out from all the 3 panelists about, if you've encountered in your research any examples of African or Latin American actors working with Chinese legal experts who are litigating in Chinese courts on these environmental issues. And if so, what other lessons that are, what kind of lessons have you identified?
And can we take the second question, please?
Thank you for the panelists. I am a Chinese lawyer, and now I'm a Humphrey Fellow and visiting scholar at American University. And in China, I working on the environmental law, climate change law, and energy law. So actually, my question is similar for the first question. Actually, for the I just want to give some comments of the topics. Firstly, it's about the transparency in China. Actually, you know that in the past like 20 or 10 years in China, the transparency, especially for the environmental transparency, it has improved a lot. And especially for the public access for the environmental data or environmental information. But actually for the international issue, there is also like transparency and national security. And as far as I know about the investment in Africa and in the Latin American, most companies are like state-owned companies, but we know that there is a increase in the non-state-owned companies in the investment in the Africa and Latin American in these years. So my question is about, because I'm a lawyer, so I want to ask a question from the lawyer's perspective. What is the challenges and opportunities for like the lawyers, like working in like for the Chinese state-owned companies and non-state-owned companies that investing in African or Latin American? What is the challenges from the local perspective? Yeah.
Thank you very much. If I can restate the question very quickly, is what are the opportunities and challenges that Chinese legal professionals will face when interacting with governments and other private actors?
Yeah.
In I don't know, structuring these investments. Okay,
Yeah.
Got it. We are very short on time, so I will ask my panelists to be super women and answer the question. The two questions in 1 minute or less each. So
Very quickly. So, Paul, I actually asked that question specifically when I did my field research in Lamu. And the activists were in transnational environmentalist networks, but they were not connected with Chinese activists. However, they were very well versed in Chinese environmental law and the process in which the progressive laws in China came about because of activism. And rhetorically, they used that in interactions with the Chinese government. They said, hey, these are your laws on the books. Why are there a different set of standards here? So rhetorically, that has been powerful. But there is an aspiration for that solidarity, that transnational solidarity to happen. But there was solidarity in other parts of Asia, especially South Asia, and a lot of solidarity within Africa. There is a very robust network of environmental justice lawyers across the continent that actually collaborate on legal cases. They have a very strong web presence. The legal libraries, you can do case searches, in which you can see very specific cases in which African lawyers have contested development projects based on failure to follow processes like the environmental impact assessments. So that information is out there.
Thank you. It's a very good question, and I would also like to see a case of a litigation and study it, but unfortunately, I don't know any. I would say in terms of opportunities and challenges, some of the challenges that we see with the development project will also apply. The political project that must be implemented within a specific deadline because you have electoral calendar ahead will apply in terms of challenges in those specific settings. Yeah.
Victoria? you have the last word.
Really quickly, I think that I love the idea of Anita of like knowledge. In Latin America, unfortunately, there is no knowledge about the Chinese laws exactly, and I think that that's something that we need to highlight. I think that in contrast with the African cases, at least what I've been able to see in Latin America, it is actually the different NGOs and different social, I guess. Oh God, my brain is going. But NGOs, civil society groups that have actually helped in keeping these Chinese companies accountable. So in here, there has been not necessarily coordination from a regional perspective, but rather within each countries, these are the organizations that have worked with communities and have actually worked. And I think that for the question of, for example, the Chinese lawyers, what they should know, right? Don't assume that every country is going to have the same laws or the same agencies. I think it's very distinct, and there are going to be countries in which these mechanisms are going to be stronger than others. And I think that the ones that come at the top of my head, for example, like Chile is one of them, has really strengthened some of these mechanisms. And in some cases, like Ecuador, although the enforceability is a little bit weaker, right? You do have, for example, its own constitution where environmental issues are really highlighted. So again, I think that it will really depend on which country you are focusing on. And that's part of our challenge, right? That there is no a regional consensus, but rather you really have to look at it a case by case.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Victoria. And with that, let me close the panel. Thank you so much to our great panelists, my super women, for sharing their research, their insight with us this afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.